This is the Day of Battle podcast. I'm your host, Joe Hayes. Welcome back. Today we're going to get into 3 different stories. I'm going to tie them all in a nice, pretty bow for you. And before I get to that, I just want to say, if you have any questions for the podcast, any comments, you can reach me at dayofbattlepodcast@gmail.com, or you can, on most platforms you listen to, you can comment or like or subscribe there. And if you find the content that I'm pushing out there valuable and meaningful, then I would encourage you to ship it out to somebody that you think needs it. So let's get into this today. 3 stories, and I want to tie them together. I want to make them all make sense. So let me start out with this. Who is the most well-known Army general in your mind? If you think about that for a minute, maybe a few come across. But if you asked me that question, I would have to say it would be General George Patton. He is the most prominent Army general in my mind. The man had a reputation that just spanned generations. He was his own man, his own type of leader. You know, people lead today in the style of Patton. It's a choice that they make. There are many negative aspects to the leadership of Patton, which we're going to get into one of those today. And I love General Patton, without a doubt. And my love for him began as a young boy when my dad showed me the movie Patton. General Patton was played by George C. Scott, and he just did such an amazing job with it. And it was funny, it was sad. There was times where you're just looking at what's going on in the movie and you're just caught by the history of it all. And then other times you're laughing at how George C. Scott portrays General Patton. I highly encourage you to watch it. But there's a scene in the movie when General Patton is visiting a battlefield hospital, I believe during the African campaign, and he's awarding a soldier a Purple Heart. And this soldier is unconscious. He's got a head wound, I believe. And then as General Patton displays that Purple Heart upon the pillow of that soldier, he retracts from him and he's getting ready to leave the hospital and he's got his helmet on. And he comes across a soldier that is in his uniform and sitting down crying. And General Patton stops and he says, "What is this? What's wrong with you?" And the man says that, "I just can't take it anymore, General." And Patton goes into asking him a few questions like, "What do you mean you can't take it?" And accuses him of being a coward. And then he gets extremely angry at him, slaps him upside the helmet with his gloves, demands that he be returned to the front lines to fight, and that he will not have any cowardice in a hospital of men who have fought on the fields of valor. And he sends the man up to the front, and Patton is in a rage with this soldier that is, in Patton's opinion, just being a coward. And it's to the front with this man. And you may die, and so be it, but you are going to the front. Patton ends up getting in some deep trouble over this. If my memory serves me correctly, he ends up missing out on certain aspects of World War II because his command is stripped from him to a degree. And he ends up missing out, I believe, on D-Day for this. But then he ends up coming back into the picture of World War II at the Battle of the Bulge. And Patton is owed so much for his leadership, his tenacity, and just going through the enemy with all that he has. That man lived for combat. And so my hat is off to him. But you see this picture of him, this glimpse in this field hospital, and knowing what we know now about post-traumatic stress disorder, about trauma, we can understand in our 2021 worldview that this soldier definitely had enough. And you can go back through the generations of different wars, and you see these guys, let's say coming out of World War I, that have been down in the trenches and they've been getting shelled by artillery for months on end. And these guys' nerves have just had it. Some of them are almost epileptic. And combat trauma does a lot to you. We see that today among our veterans that are coming home from Iraq or Afghanistan. And, I'm one of them. And combat trauma has done a lot to my nerves. And so I see where that soldier in that field hospital is coming from. And are there cases of cowardice? Of course. It's going to be across the board, throughout the ranks, throughout the services. That happens. Not all men are meant to go to combat. And in this particular situation, I don't know what the soldier's case was, but it's highlighted in the movie because of what Patton did and how he acted under this situation. And really, it was a negative thing for him to do as a leader. And so I want to bring you into story number 2. And if I asked you, who is the most famous Marine general of all time, I think you would have to say it's Lewis, a.k.a. Chesty Puller. Chesty Puller, I think, is the most famous of all time. He is the most awarded Marine of all time with 5 Navy Crosses. And Chesty enlisted in the Marine Corps during World War I. Although General Puller never fought in World War I, he was sent to Haiti and to Nicaragua. And then he later fought in World War II, all the way through Korea. And he wanted to fight in Vietnam, but the Marine Corps wouldn't let him. And things started getting political for him. And he was pretty much forced out as a lieutenant general. Chesty Puller is, I believe, the most famous leader of the Marine Corps. I mean, when you're in boot camp, you say, "Good night, Chesty," before you hit the rack. Chesty Puller is just the most iconic of all. And really, his leadership is characterized always in such a positive light. Contrasting that to General Patton, where you have these outbursts where Patton was just thought of as, he wants his medals, he wants his glory, he doesn't care what he's got to do to achieve those things. He'll use anybody he has to use in order to accomplish the mission. With all of the good aspects for General Patton, Chesty doesn't have the rumors that Patton does in a negative light. And so the story I want to highlight today of Chesty, during the island campaigns of World War II, Chesty was leading Marines in Cape Gloucester. So it's over in the South Pacific. It's the jungle campaigns, extremely hot, humid, swampy environments, horrible environments. And in this particular time, he was a lieutenant colonel. Chesty would be up checking the front lines of the Marines as they're dug into fighting holes. This book that I was reading, detailing out these circumstances, talked about the carnage inside of these holes that he would come across. He would see things like a Marine that is missing his head, sitting in a foxhole with his dog tag still around his neck. He would go on to another hole and find another young Marine there that is just petrified and saying, "What good does it even do for us to shoot these guys? Because I've shot 3 of them and it doesn't matter. They just keep on coming." That is the scene in Cape Gloucester. It's horrible. It's horrific. And upon visiting one fighting hole of a Marine, the man tells Puller, "Colonel, we got to get out of here. We've just got to get out of here." And what you see Chesty Puller do is something quite different than what General Patton did under a similar situation where one of his troops is under extreme combat stress. And so what happens is Chesty grabs this soldier and he says, "Come on back here, old man." And he'd always call his troops, however young they were, he'd always call them old man. He'd say, "Come on back here, old man. Let's go talk about this." And they went behind the friendly lines a few feet and they sat down together and just talked with each other. And Chesty explained to him that here he was, 45 years or so on into life, and he had things back home that he wanted to attend to as well, with his wife and his children, and he had a life to live outside of the war. But he said, but that's not what I can do right now. What I've got to do right now is focus on the mission. And this encouraged this young Marine to the point that he was willing to go back to his fighting hole and continue on. And so Chesty sends him on back to his hole, and with a cheer up old man kind of attitude, and tells him that if he gets a chance, he's going to bring some hot chow up to him and take care of him. And so you see this type of morale boosting leadership from Chesty Puller, where he could have slapped the snot out of this kid and slapped his gloves across his helmet for saying, "Colonel, we gotta get out of here." I mean, what young private is going to say that to a colonel? That's kind of unheard of. But he had such a reputation with his men, and he was so open and approachable because of his leadership, that he could have a young private or PFC tell him that honestly. And with that, they had his trust and he had theirs. And what does he do with it? Of course, he brings them back behind the lines, and he sits down with them and lays out the plan before them so that they see it and they go, yeah, I'm going to do this for this guy because he's got my back, and so I've got his. And that's the type of leader Chesty was. And that reputation followed him his entire career. And that's why he was successful in World War II, in Korea, when he was surrounded by the 1 million-man army from China coming down into the Korean peninsula, and Chesty leading the entire 1st Marine Division out in the snow. Chesty is absolutely my hero. And so this next story that I'm going to share with you today is not about Chesty. It's not about Patton. It's not about any American general. It is about the commander of the Lord's army and how he deals with it when one of his troops can't take it anymore. So let's get into this. If you are able to, check out John chapter 21, the last chapter of the book of John. What you've got here is a situation where Peter and several of the disciples are out in a boat and they're fishing. And they've been fishing all night long. And this is after the resurrection of Jesus has occurred. And these guys are out there fishing, I think, because they have lost their way. Christ is risen from the dead, but these guys decide, let's go fishing. And for all of their time that they had walked with Jesus for the last 3 years, they haven't been professional fishermen. They've been following Jesus in their lives every day. And they make good decisions and they make bad decisions. But at the arrest of Jesus, most of them flee. We'll talk about what else happens. But they are all despairing. And then several of them see him very soon after the resurrection. And so you've got them still, I think, dejected. And they're out on the water at night in this boat. And they're fishing. And they don't catch a darn thing out there. As morning comes, I just picture it lighting up a little bit, and they see this figure upon the shore. And this man says to them, "Throw your nets on the other side." And they do. And suddenly their nets are just full of fish. And the story goes on, and it says that John said, "It's the Lord." And then when Peter heard John say that, Peter grabs his jacket, throws it on, and jumps in the water and starts swimming to shore to go see Jesus. And when he gets there, he finds Jesus. He's got a little campfire, and he's cooking some fish. And so the other disciples, they finally drag the fish to shore, and everybody comes around, and it seems like they're sitting around this fire. And then I think it got awkward for a minute, because if you know what happened before this, remember the disciples largely had fled at the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. John had followed after Jesus and watched the trial. Peter had also followed after Jesus, but just as Jesus had prophesied, Peter denied Jesus 3 times during his trial or post-arrest. And if you could just imagine the awkwardness of the situation for Peter, he really let down his friend. He really let down his commander at this point in time. Here he is standing in front of the risen Jesus Christ, and he is remembering very clearly in his head that several days ago, 3 times in one night, he had vehemently denied knowing Jesus or following him or being his friend. And he knows that Jesus was quite aware of it. And so what does Jesus do? Here Jesus has this soldier, this follower in front of him that has not stood up as he should in the day of battle. He has fallen. He has let down his commander. Let's see what Jesus does. So they're sitting there. It says, and when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Peter says to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus says to him, feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he says to him, tend my sheep. And then he says to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And it says at this point that Peter was grieved because Jesus said to him this third time, do you love me? And Peter says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. So with Peter, with his thrice denial of Jesus Christ, Jesus gives him 3 opportunities to reaffirm his love for him. And I think that's beautiful. And that's who our God is. He does not hold these things against us where they cannot be overcome. The restoration can happen completely. And you don't see Jesus take off his gloves and smack Peter on the head and say, get back up to the front, like a General Patton would do. Instead, you see this love, this affection, this restoration, where Peter knows he screwed up royally. I mean, he let down the commander of the Lord's army. He let down the second person of the Godhead. He let down the King of Israel. And the King of Israel says, well, do you love me? 3 times, to let him make up for the 3 times that he denied him. That is who Jesus is. This matters for us because every single one of us today can remember a time where we let down the commander of the Lord's army. Because we are supposed to be that soldier for God, that warrior for Christ. And you know what? Sometimes we don't keep up our end of the deal. And life happens and our failures are illuminated and we realize, you know what? I really screwed up this time again. It's very easy for us to start measuring our relationship with God as we would with another person. Because if we know we let down another person, we know that it's going to take time to build the trust back, and maybe they won't give it to us, whereas another person would more readily give it to us, and it depends on personality types. But we like to think of God as being like that, and he's not. God gives that restoration to us freely and perfectly. There is nothing held in reserve for him to give to us later. He gives it all. It's infinite. And so we can have the confidence that Peter had at this point in time that he was right with God after this. And that yes, he had disgraced the uniform. He had let down his commander, but it was over. It was over because it was over. We can have that same confidence. We're going to have our failures out there. And we need to do all that we can to not have them. Because as Paul says, do I just continue sinning because of grace? No, I should not do that. We want to treasure the grace of Christ and the mercy that he has for us. We don't want to abuse that. But at the same time, when we are overtaken in our sins and we make that failure, we know that the forgiveness is complete, just like Peter had. So what happens? It goes on, and Jesus tells Peter, he says, most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. And it says, this he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. Peter failed Jesus at the arrest. When it was going to cost him something, when it was going to cost Peter possibly being one of these revolutionary characters and possibly being put to death next to Jesus. He avoided that. He lied about his relationship with Christ in order to save his own butt. But Jesus predicts something else in the life of Peter that would happen later. And he is saying that one day you're going to stretch out your arms and you're going to be carried to a place you do not want to go. And that is, you are going to be crucified as well, Peter. And that's exactly what we see happen. We know a lot about the story of the martyrdom of Peter. And Peter is one of the most famous martyrs of all church history because of how he chose to die. You see, when Peter was being put to death, before they killed him, they crucified his wife. And I want you to think about the reality of your wife being crucified in front of you and having to watch that play out. Peter had to do that. And after he watched his wife die from crucifixion, they said, okay, now we're going to crucify you. And Peter did something that nobody else has ever done. He said, hang on a second. I am not worthy to die by crucifixion because my Lord died like that. Could you please turn me upside down when you crucify me? And so they did. So you see the intestinal fortitude and the faith of Peter play out there at his death. And that didn't come to him all at once. It came from his failures. It came from his learning from his mistakes. It came from him accepting the fact that he was a failure, but then accepting the restoration of Jesus. And he really died a faithful servant of the commander of the Lord of hosts. And he did something in following this command. At the end of this portion of John, where Jesus is having this dialogue with Peter, he tells him 3 times, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. And then he predicts the manner in which he's going to die. And at the end of it, he says, follow me. That's the command. And that's the command for you. You may be a failure. You may feel like everybody's looking at you and they know what you've done and they know how you claim to be a believer in Christ, and yet you keep letting down your end of the deal. Peter felt like that too. Think about it. Books were written about Peter and his failure. He's still regarded as this guy that shot first and asked questions later. And if he ever did ask a question of God, it was like the dumb question. He's still thought of as that guy. But look at how he died. I don't think he cared about what anybody thought. I think he cared about one thing. When Jesus said, follow me, Peter said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. We're all going to have our day of battle. We're all going to have our failure. But failure is not final. We are going to keep pushing on. And Jesus tells Peter, follow me. And you know this, that the Lord goes before you, and the God of Israel is your rear guard. He says, follow me because he's in the front. He has your 12, and he has your 6.